And one of the issues that we've heard previously is about the palliative care sector and how the palliative care sector is relatively underfunded. And those who provide end-of-life care are sort of struggling at the moment. And given that we're really struggling to cope with the demand that people have at the moment, without further money going into the palliative care sector, there is a criticism that some would turn to assisted dying because they cannot access palliative care. How would you respond to that?
It is, as you say, Dr. Gohani, it's one of the concerns that's very often raised. I think it's important that we avoid seeing this as a zero-sum game, an either-or. I think we do need more investment in palliative care, particularly around access. I mean, I think there will always be improvements that we want to make in terms of palliative care, but the issue that seems to arise more often than not is one of access rather than the quality itself. I think also an understanding that palliative care isn't just at the specialist hospice end. I mean, palliative care is more often delivered by doctors, nurses in other settings. And I think what has been clear from the debate around this issue, around my bill, is that the needs of palliative care are ones that are given less attention in the overall debate around health and care services than other parts of the health and care setup. And you can perhaps see why that is the case, given the pressures on some other parts of the health service. But I think one of the real positives about this debate is it's shone a light on those issues, but it's not an either-or. We need both. We also know, again, looking at jurisdictions around the world that have not just a terminal illness model, actually the more expansive models hold true in this respect, but from the States and the US, from the States and Australia, where a similar model has been introduced in more recent times, we see that the vast majority of those that are accessing an assisted death are in some form of palliative care or have had access to palliative care. And therefore, it demonstrates that these are people who have, to their mind, exhausted what palliative care can provide for them, and that this is the choice that they opt for at that point. I think the figures in relation to Oregon most recently, around 90% are in receipt of palliative care or have had palliative care. In the States, in Australia, Victoria, Queensland, I think the figures are north of 80%. And again, that's a fairly consistent picture. So we do need to improve access to palliative care. As I say, I think the debate around this bill has provided a platform for those in the palliative care sector to make that argument. But I would caution against seeing this as an either-or, because, as I say, overwhelmingly those that are accessing this in other jurisdictions with similar models and other types of models, they are in receipt of often the best palliative care. And what this demonstrates, and as palliative care practitioners themselves would acknowledge, palliative care can do wonderful things, but it can't always meet the needs of those with a terminal illness, and that's what's reflected, I think, in the figures that we see.
Thank you for that. And so we've also heard from previous witnesses that by passing the bill, we will open the door to a slippery slope or mission creep or scope creep. And they cite, just as you have there, Canada, Oregon and the Netherlands as examples. Do you think that will happen here through legal challenges? And how do we safeguard against it?
Again, I think the slippery slope argument is one that is consistently made. I think I would point the committee to the report published by the Health Committee in the House of Commons in February last year, at the end of an 18-month inquiry into assisted dying and end-of-life choices, which concluded there was no international evidence of a jurisdiction that had introduced a terminal illness mental capacity model similar to the one that I'm proposing and that's been considered by Westminster at the moment, where the eligibility criteria have changed. That was, I think, confirmed in the evidence the committee heard from the witnesses involved in the process in Australia. I think in Oregon, while there have been minor changes, for example, to the residency requirement, where I think it was found over the years that the residency requirement didn't provide any meaningful safeguard at all, and therefore it was removed. But the eligibility criteria of terminal illness and mental capacity hasn't changed. I think the argument that one of the witnesses was making to try and substantiate the claim of a slippery slope in Oregon is that different conditions were featuring to a greater or lesser extent in terms of who was accessing assisted dying. But I don't think necessarily that says anything other than that patient confidence, medic confidence in the procedures, perhaps evolves over time. That those with certain conditions find that the palliative care that is available meets the needs up until a point, but they find themselves beyond that at a certain stage. I think with Canada and the Netherlands, I've always acknowledged that those are more expansive models. They've always been more expansive models. In the case of the Netherlands, that has been over very many years. The Canadian model that is very often cited has evolved. It's evolved through court process, which is sometimes kind of brought into the debate here as somehow a risk. But the constitutional arrangements in Canada are very, very different to the ones here in Scotland and in the UK. So the introduction of the legislation came about as a result of a case brought before the Supreme Court in Canada on the basis of the Canadian Constitution that the ban on assisted dying was unconstitutional. Parliament then introduced legislation. It wasn't felt to go far enough. It was then legally challenged under appeal, which was upheld, and the scope was expanded further. So the arrangements in Canada and in the Netherlands, both of which enjoy, again, overwhelming public support, are very different than what is being proposed here. And that, as I say, I think there is no example of a terminal illness mental capacity model having been introduced, whether in the US, whether in Australia or New Zealand, where the eligibility criteria have changed.